Anthony Reeves wiped down the weathered countertop for the 5th time that morning, scrubbing at a stain that had long ago become a permanent feature of the synthetic surface. The repetitive motion gave his restless hand something to do in the echoing silence of his empty dining hall. 3 months had passed since the last tourist group had ventured through Nova Orlia, the once promising lunar colony nestled on the far side of the moon. What had begun as humanity's shining achievement, a self-sustaining community beyond Earth's protective atmosphere, had devolved into a forgotten outpost, caught in the crossfire of interplanetary politics and trade disputes that seemed to grow more complex with each passing cycle. The sign outside still flickered weakly with a promise of Earth home cooking, though Anthony sometimes wondered why he bothered maintaining it. The colony administration had cut his power allocation twice in the past month alone, citing necessary conservation measures for non-essential services, their impersonal, automated notices. One more reduction and he would be reduced to cooking over an open flame, if such a thing were even possible in the carefully regulated oxygen environment of the colony. Anthony paused in his mindless cleaning, looking around at the dining hall that had once bustled with the excited chatter of travelers from across the solar system. 15 tables, each capable of seating 6 people, now stood in perfect untouched order. The synthetic plants that decorated the corners, poor imitations of earth greenery, had gathered a fine layer of dust that the cleaning drones no longer music bothered to remove. Even the automated dispensers behind the counter, once filled with an array of beverages from various worlds, now contained only recycled water and a synthetic coffee substitute that tasted nothing like the real thing. This wasn't the future Anthony had envisioned when he'd sold his modest restaurant in Chicago and purchased passage to Nova Orlia 5 years ago. Colony had been booming then, a crucial waypoint for exploratory missions to Mars and the outer planets. His small establishment had quickly become known for providing a taste of home to weary travelers and homesick colonists alike. Now it was just another casualty of shifting political winds and economic pressures that seemed increasingly remote from the everyday struggles of ordinary people caught in their path. A soft hiss interrupted his melancholy reflections as the main door slid open, letting in a gust of artificially regulated air. Anthony looked up, half expecting to see the familiar crisp uniform of a colony inspector coming to deliver yet another reduction in his resource allocation, or worse, a final eviction notice. Instead, 2 small figures stood hesitantly at the threshold, their outlines blurred by the stark contrast between the dimly lit corridor outside and the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the dining hall. They were what? Children. That much was immediately clear from their size and proportions, but not human children. As they cautiously stepped forward, Anthony could see their skin shimmered with a soft blue luminescence under the unforgiving lights, a characteristic he recognized from his limited encounters with cerulean visitors in the colony's more prosperous days. Their eyes, significantly larger than human eyes and lacking discernible pupils, darted nervously around the room, taking in every detail with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. They wore simple, gray clothing that hung loosely on their thin frames, the fabric frayed at the edges and stained in places, telling a story of prolonged hardship. Around each of their necks hung a small, translating pendant, standard issue for non-English speaking visitors to the human-administered sectors of the colony. The taller one, perhaps equivalent to a 10-year-old human girl in development, clutched the smaller one's hand, protectively positioning herself slightly in front of her companion. They both seemed to be holding their breath, poised to flee at the slightest sign of hostility or rejection. "We are looking for food," came the mechanical voice from the taller child's pendant, the flat electronic tones, unable to fully mask the undercurrent of desperation in the original Serlian speech. Anthony stood motionless for several heartbeats, surprise giving way to a deeper emotion as he took in the hollow cheeks and prominent bones visible beneath the blue skin. Their clothing, though obviously cared for as best as possible given limited resources, had clearly been worn for far too long without replacement. But it was their eyes that affected him most deeply, eyes that held a weariness no child should have to develop, caution born from repeated disappointment and potential danger. "Come in," he said, finally gesturing toward the empty tables with a welcoming sweep of his arm. "Please sit wherever you like." The children exchanged quick glances, silent communication passing between them before the older one gave an almost imperceptible nod. They moved into the dining hall with careful steps, choosing the table farthest from the door and partially hidden in the shadows of the corner. The smaller child, who appeared equivalent to perhaps a 6-year-old human, kept her face partially obscured in the folds of what looked like a makeshift cloak fashioned from discarded packing material. The older one maintained a vigilant watch over every movement Anthony made, her large eyes tracking him with the careful attention of someone who had learned the hard way that adults of any species could not be trusted without proof. "My name is Anthony," he offered, approaching their table with deliberately slow and transparent movements, keeping his hands visible at all times. "What are your names?" The older child hesitated, her large eyes narrowing slightly in calculation. Several moments passed before she finally spoke, her words filtered through the translator with mechanical precision. "And GT, clears throat. "And GT, I am Alisansa," she said, the pronunciation of her name retaining the musical quality of her native language, despite the translator's limitations. With a gentle nudge, she prompted the younger child, "This is Kelia." "Alisansa and Kelia," Anthony repeated, doing his best to match the nuanced pronunciation. "I'm very pleased to meet both of you. Are you hungry?" The question was unnecessary, he realized as soon as the words left his mouth. The gauntness of their features, the slight tremor in their small hands, and the way Kelia's eyes had immediately fixed on the preparation area behind the counter told him everything he needed to know about their nutritional state. Without waiting for a verbal confirmation, he turned toward the kitchen. "Please wait here," he said, with a reassuring smile. "I will prepare something for you to eat right away." In the kitchen, Anthony surveyed his dwindling supplies with a critical eye. The weekly shipment wasn't scheduled for another 3 days, assuming it arrived on time, which had become increasingly rare as the colony's supply chains suffered from the same neglect as its tourism industry. He had some vegetables from the colonies. Hydroponics gardens, slightly wilted but still nutritious. A few preserved items shipped from Earth at considerable expense and synthetic protein that could be programmed to approximate the flavor and texture of almost anything, though never quite convincingly enough to satisfy those with memories of the real thing. He decided on a hearty vegetable stew, reasoning that its simple ingredients and comforting warmth would appeal across species boundaries. More importantly, the basic components were universally digestible for most known sentient species, including cerealians whose physiology shared enough similarities with humans to make food compatibility a minor concern. He chopped the vegetables with practiced efficiency, the familiar rhythm of knife against cutting board a welcome distraction from the troubling questions forming in his mind. What were two cerealian children doing alone in this sector of the colony? Where were their parents or guardians? And how long had they been hungry, truly hungry, before desperation drove them to approach a stranger? The warmth of the cooking elements in the aromatic steam rising from the pot offered a comforting counterpoint to the sterile chill that had become the dining hall's usual atmosphere. For the first time in months, Anthony felt the simple satisfaction of preparing food for someone who genuinely needed it, rather than going through the motions of readiness for customers who never arrived. When Anthony returned to the dining room, carrying two steaming bowls, he found Alisansa whispering urgently to Kealia in their native language, a musical series of flowing syllables that the translators were inactivated to convert. They fell silent at his approach, Alisansa's posture stiffening while Kealia pressed closer to her companion's side. Vegetable stew, he explained, setting the bowls carefully before them, and some bread. He placed a small basket containing several pieces of synthetic bread, not particularly flavorful but dense with nutrients between them. The bread is slightly warm. I recommend eating it while it still has some heat. Alisansa studied the food with intense scrutiny, her large eyes narrowing as she examined the contents of the bowl from multiple angles. This is safe for us to consume. Her translator conveyed the question with mechanical flatness, but the genuine worry in her eyes required no technological interpretation. Yes, Anthony assured her with confidence, I have prepared this specifically to be safe for cerulean physiology. No animal products, no synthetic proteins containing human specific enzymes, nothing that would cause adverse reactions. The stew contains only vegetables grown in the colony's hydroponics bay, and the bread is made from universal compatibility grain substitutes. Both children looked up sharply at his words, a new wariness entering their expressions. You recognize our species, Alyssand asked, her body tensing visibly as though preparing for sudden flight. Anthony nodded, realizing belatedly that his casual identification might have alarmed them further. I have served customers from throughout the solar system during my time here, he explained. The blue luminescence of your skin is distinctive of cerulean physiology, though there haven't been many ceruleans on this side of the moon for some time now. Not since the... He trailed off, suddenly aware that discussing complex interplanetary politics with clearly hungry and potentially vulnerable children wasn't helpful or necessary. Regardless, I can assure you that the food is completely safe. You have my promise. The children exchanged another meaningful look, a silent communication passing between them that spoke of shared experiences and established trust. After a moment of apparent deliberation, Kelia reached hesitantly for a piece of bread. She brought it to her nose first, inhaling its aroma with careful attention before taking a tiny, experimental bite. When nothing alarming happened, she took another larger bite, her eyes widening slightly at the simple pleasure of having something to fill her empty stomach. Alicent watched her younger companion intently for several moments, vigilant for any sign of adverse reaction before cautiously tasting the stew herself. She dipped a provided spoon into the bowl, examined the contents one final time, then placed it in her mouth with deliberate care. The transformation was immediate and profound. Kalia's face, previously tight with a combination of hunger and anxiety, softened into a genuine smile that seemed to illuminate her entire being from within. It was a pure expression of childish joy, unguarded and transparent in its simple pleasure of having a full stomach after what had clearly been too long without proper nourishment. Something in Anthony's chest constricted painfully at the sight, a complex emotion that mingled sympathy for their previous hunger with a renewed faith that perhaps genuine kindness still had meaning in this fractured world. It provides adequate nutrition, Alicent admitted, her own smile more reserved but no less genuine. The formal phrasing suggested by the translator couldn't disguise the relief and gratitude in her voice. We express appreciation for your generosity. Anthony waved away the formal thanks with a casual gesture. Please eat as much as you want, he encouraged them. There is plenty more if you are still hungry after finishing what is in front of you. He retreated behind the counter to give the children space, busying himself with wiping down surfaces that were already immaculately clean. He deliberately avoided staring directly at them while they ate, understanding instinctively that they would be uncomfortable with scrutiny during this vulnerable activity. Nevertheless, he observed them from the corner of his eye, noting the gradual relaxation of their postures as their bodies recognized the promise of nourishment. They ate slowly at first, with the careful discipline of those who had learned to make scarce resources last. But as their initial caution gave way to growing trust, their pace increased, hunger overriding learned restraint. When their bowls were empty, Anthony silently approached with the pot to provide second helpings, adding additional bread to the basket without comment or expectation of thanks. May I inquire about your parents or guardians? He asked casually as he set down their refilled bowls, keeping his tone conversational rather than interrogative. Alicent's expression immediately hardened, the momentary relaxation vanishing beneath a mask of practiced neutrality. Our guardian attends an extended gathering, she said vaguely, the translator failing to convey the subtle shift in her tone that suggested the statement might not be entirely truthful. We will return to our designated location soon. Anthony nodded, accepting the explanation without visible skepticism. Despite his internal doubts, their worn clothing, the obvious signs of prolonged malnutrition, and the fact that they were alone seeking food told a Different story than that of children. Under the care of diplomatic representatives or merchants who would normally comprise the Cyrillian presence. In a human-administered colony, these children looked as though they lived not in the climate-controlled comfort of the diplomatic sectors with their abundant resources, but somewhere in the neglected periphery of the colony's infrastructure, the technical maintenance areas and forgotten quarters where security patrols rarely ventured and where colony administrators had little interest in maintaining standards. You are welcome to return tomorrow if you find yourselves in need of additional sustenance, Anthony said as they finally pushed away their empty bowls after third helpings. I opened the establishment at the same time each day. Elisande regarded him with a complex mixture of wary hope and ingrained suspicion. You would permit our return without compensation? Of course, Anthony confirmed without hesitation. I am here every day and there is always food available for those who need it. Kalia tugged insistently on her companion's sleeve, whispering something in their native language that the translators weren't activated to interpret. Elisande listened intently before nodding and rising to her feet with fluid grace. We must depart now, she announced with formal precision. We extend gratitude for the provided nutrition. Anthony remained behind the counter, understanding instinctively that approaching them might trigger their evident flight response. You're very welcome, he said simply. Please remember, you can return whenever you need to. He watched as they made their way toward the door, noting how Elisande maintained a protective position between Kalia and himself throughout their retreat, her body language suggesting she remained prepared for potential threat. Despite the peaceful encounter, just before they slipped through the door, Kalia turned back unexpectedly and raised her small hand in a waving gesture, a surprisingly human expression of farewell that spoke to either cultural observation or some universal constant of childhood communication across species boundaries. Anthony found himself automatically waving in return, a smile forming unbidden on his face at this small connection. After they departed, the familiar silence settled once again over the dining hall, but something fundamental had changed in its quality. The emptiness no longer felt like abandonment but like potential, a space waiting to be filled again with purpose and connection. For the first time in many months, Anthony found himself looking forward to the arrival of the next day with something approaching genuine anticipation. The children returned the following day at precisely the same time, their appearance at the door more confident than during their initial visit, though still marked by the careful vigilance of those accustomed to navigating potentially hostile environments. They chose the same table in the shadowed corner but sat with slightly more relaxed postures, Kalia no longer hiding her face in her makeshift cloak. Anthony greeted them warmly and immediately brought freshly prepared stew and bread without waiting for a formal request. I made extra today, he commented casually as he set down their bowls. I hoped you might return. A pattern established itself over the subsequent days. The children would arrive at the same time each day, eat their fill of whatever Anthony had prepared, and then disappear back into the depths of the colony without revealing their destination. They never mentioned their living situation, or the identity of their supposedly absent guardian, though. Occasionally, Alisanza would share carefully filtered fragments of information about their daily activities. Our guardian instructs us in Earth languages, she mentioned one afternoon. As they consumed their meal, the translation devices provide immediate communication, but understanding without technological assistance remains a valuable skill. What other subjects do you study? Anthony inquired, sitting at their table. For the first time, a development made possible by the gradually increasing comfort and trust the children demonstrated in his presence. They no longer tensed when he approached, though Alisanza maintained her habitual vigilance, her large eyes constantly monitoring the entrance and other potential avenues of approach. Mathematics and computational theory, Alisanza replied with evident pride. The applications of geometric principles across different dimensional frameworks, historical analysis of interplanetary development patterns. Her formal recitation suggested an advanced educational program despite their apparent circumstances. Kalia's studies focus on more foundational concepts appropriate to her developmental stage. She demonstrates particular interest in Earth biological diversity. The younger girl nodded enthusiastically, swallowing a mouthful of food before adding through her translator. The creatures with external dermal coverings consisting of filamentous protein structures, the ones possessing extended posterior appendages, they appear tactily pleasing. Anthony chuckled at the overly technical description. You mean animals with fur and tails, like cats and dogs? Yes, Kalia confirmed, her eyes brightening with genuine excitement. Their coverings fur must feel most agreeable to touch, does it? It does, Anthony confirmed, finding himself smiling at her enthusiasm. I had a cat once back on Earth before relocating to Nova Orlia. His name was Rusty, and his fur was the color of Mars terrain. Very soft. He used to sleep on top of my head during night cycles. This revelation sent Kalia into a fit of musical laughter, the sound requiring no translation to communicate her delight. At this image, even Alisanza's habitual reserve cracked, her expression softening into a genuine smile that transformed her features from wary guardedness to something closer to the carefree child she should have been permitted to remain. As the weeks progressed, Anthony found himself increasingly attentive to subtle details about the children that raised his concern. Their clothing, though meticulously maintained with obvious care, showed signs of progressive deterioration that suggested no access to replacement items. There was a tear along Kalia's sleeve that had been repaired with remarkable skill, but using clearly improvised materials. Alisanza's footwear was beginning to separate at critical structural points, requiring increasingly creative reinforcement to maintain functionality. More worrying were the occasional physical indicators of hardship beyond simple resource scarcity. Anthony glimpsed a discolored area on Alisanza's arm that resembled a healing contusion when her sleeve shifted during a particularly animated description of a mathematical concept. Kalia sometimes exhibited a slight wince when reaching across the table, suggesting possible muscular strain or minor injury that remained untreated. Are you encountering any difficulties in your current living arrangement? Anthony asked one day. keeping his tone deliberately casual, while setting down a special dessert he had prepared, a synthetic approximation of earth fruit, combined with a protein-rich base that would provide additional nutrients beyond their regular meals. Alisansa's defensive barriers immediately reasserted themselves, her posture straightening and her expression closing like a door being shut against unwelcome intrusion. Our circumstances remain adequate for our requirements, she stated with careful precision, the translator unable to fully mask the sudden tension in her voice. Our guardian ensures necessary provisions. Anthony didn't press further, recognizing the counterproductive nature of pursuing questions that clearly triggered defensive responses. Instead, he adjusted his approach to addressing their evident needs through less direct means. He began preparing additional food each day, carefully packaging the surplus insulated containers designed to maintain temperature and freshness for extended periods. These he would present to the children as they prepared to leave, framing the offering as casual surplus rather than deliberate charity. We prepared excessively today, he would explain with deliberate nonchalance. These portions will be wasted if not consumed. Perhaps you might transport them to your residence for later nutritional requirements. Alisansa understood the tactical nature of this approach. Her subtle expression indicated awareness of the gentle deception, but accepted the containers with dignified gratitude rather than pride-preserving rejection. Anthony suspected the practical necessity of acquiring additional resources for whoever else might share their mysterious living situation outweighed concerns about accepting charity. One evening after the children Clear's throat had departed with their usual supply of extra food, the door to the dining hall hissed open once more to reveal an unexpected visitor. Megan stood in the entryway, her crisp security officer's uniform creating an immediate contrast with the casual atmosphere Anthony had cultivated in establishment. Her posture radiated professional authority from her perfectly regulation-compliant footwear to her meticulously maintained short haircut that eliminated any need for adjustments during extended duty cycles. Anthony, she greeted him, her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to issuing commands rather than engaging in casual conversation. We need to discuss a matter of administrative concern. He gestured toward one of the vacant tables, maintaining his hospitable demeanor despite the tension her presence automatically introduced. Please sit down. Can I offer you refreshment? The synthesized coffee substitute has improved marginally with recent programming adjustments. No, thank you. She remained standing, her sharp eyes conducting a systematic assessment of the dining hall that suggested she was looking for specific evidence rather than simply taking in the environment. Information has reached security administration indicating that you have been providing sustenance to unregistered non-human entities without appropriate documentation and tracking. This constitutes a violation of Colony Protocol Section 47, Paragraph 6, regarding interspecies resource allocation and monitoring. Anthony set down the cleaning cloth he had been using with deliberate calmness. Their children, Megan, young, hungry children who needed something to eat. I wasn't aware that basic compassion required administrative authorization. There is nothing basic about the current situation, she responded, a subtle shift in her expression suggesting that her official demeanor concealed more complex, personal feelings about the matter, particularly when dealing with cerulean juveniles present in a sector where their species has no authorized residential or visitation status. What does their particular species classification have to do with anything? Anthony questioned, feeling a defensive heat rising within his chest despite his efforts to maintain calm rationality. Hunger transcends taxonomic categories. Surely even colony regulations recognize that fundamental reality. Megan sighed, her rigid professional mask slipping momentarily to reveal what appeared to be genuine concern beneath the official exterior. The diplomatic landscape is considerably more complex than you may appreciate, Anthony. There are substantive reasons underlying the relocation of cerulean residents to the Earth-facing hemispheric sectors. Having unauthorized members of their species in this region creates potential complications beyond simple regulatory non-compliance. Complications like ensuring hungry children don't go unfed. Anthony challenged, unable to keep the edge from his voice despite recognizing the potentially counterproductive nature of confrontation. Complications like determining their point of origin and identifying their legal guardians, Megan countered with increasing intensity. Colony administration maintains comprehensive records of all authorized cerulean juveniles. There are 0 registered in this sector. None. This information gave Anthony pause, forcing him to reconsider his assumptions. He had presumed the children were staying with some form of guardian, as Alasansa had consistently claimed, perhaps a worker in one of the maintenance divisions or domestic staff for one of the few remaining wealthy residents who could afford such services. The complete absence of official records suggested a considerably more concerning situation. They've mentioned a guardian during our interactions, he said slowly, carefully navigating between truth and protective discretion. Whoever this supposed guardian might be, they have failed to register with colony administration, Megan stated, with the certainty of someone with direct access to relevant databases, which means they are either deliberately evading detection for concerning reasons, or she left the alternative unspoken but hanging heavily in the air between them, or this guardian doesn't actually exist, Anthony completed reluctantly, the implication sending a chill through him despite the dining hall's regulated temperature. Megan's expression softened marginally, suggesting her official position didn't entirely override her humanity. Look, I'm not here to implement punitive measures against you or terminate your operational authorization, but you need to exercise greater caution. File the appropriate documentation for any non-humans you're providing services to, regardless of their age classification, perhaps especially because of their age classification. She turned toward the exit but paused at the threshold, looking back over her shoulder. And Anthony, if you discover any substantive information regarding their residential location or supposed guardian identity, you should report it through appropriate channels. Her voice softened slightly, adding, for their protection, not just regulatory compliance. The cold calculation and lingering Suspicion she left in her wake remained, long after her departure, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Despite the dining hall's constant illumination, the following day, Anthony waited until Elisanza and Kelia had completed their meal before reaching his carefully considered decision. He couldn't continue ignoring Megan's warning without potentially risking both his ability to help the children and possibly their safety if more hardline security personnel became involved. Simultaneously, something deeper than colonial regulations, an intuitive understanding that these children face circumstances requiring assistance rather than bureaucratic processing, prevented him from simply reporting them. As Megan had suggested, I find it necessary to conclude operations earlier than usual today, he informed them with carefully cultivated casualness. Would you object if I accompanied you for a portion of your return journey? I rarely venture beyond these premises and would value the opportunity to observe more of the colony infrastructure. Elisanza immediately adopted a defensive posture, her entire body language communicating suspicion. For what purpose do you request this accompaniment? Simple curiosity regarding colony sectors. I rarely have occasion to visit, Anthony replied, maintaining a relaxed demeanor despite the tension crackling in the air between them. Nothing more complicated than that. We possess sufficient knowledge of navigational requirements, Elisanza stated firmly, already taking Kelia's hand in preparation for departure. Your assistance is unnecessary. Anthony sighed, recognizing that his casual approach had failed. Listen, he said, abandoning pretense. For honesty, a security officer visited yesterday, asking questions about you. I didn't reveal anything, he added, quickly, seeing the immediate panic that flashed across Elisanza's expressive features. But I'm concerned about your situation. If you're experiencing difficulties of some kind, perhaps I could offer assistance beyond simply providing meals. Kelia tugged insistently at her companion's sleeve, whispering rapidly. In their native language, the musical syllables flowed too quickly for Anthony to discern any pattern, but the intensity of her expression conveyed the importance she attached to whatever she was communicating. Elissa answered, responded with a sharp, negative gesture. But the younger child persisted, her expression taking on a pleading quality that seemed universal across species boundaries. A complex silent communication passed between them, conducted through subtle expressions and small gestures that spoke of a deep bond and established patterns of negotiation. Finally, Elissa's rigid posture softened slightly in reluctant acquiescence. You may accompany us for a portion of our return journey, she conceded with obvious reservations. However, you must provide your solemn assurance that you will depart when instructed, without attempting to continue observation or follow our subsequent route. Anthony nodded solemnly, recognizing the significance of this limited trust. I promise to respect your boundaries completely. They departed the dining hall together, the children naturally taking the lead through corridors that Anthony rarely had reason to traverse. The pristine main concourse of the colony, with its carefully maintained appearance designed to impress visitors who no longer came, quickly gave way to utilitarian passages primarily used by maintenance personnel and service drones. The architectural aesthetic shifted from aspirational elegance to functional practicality. Exposed conduits carrying various essential resources lined the walls. The lighting grew noticeably dimmer to conserve energy, and the carefully regulated temperature dropped several degrees, creating a perceptible chill that the children seemed completely accustomed to. They descended through multiple levels via utility elevators that required no identity verification, moving progressively deeper into the support infrastructure of Novus Eterna. Anthony had intellectually understood that the colony was a massive undertaking, but he'd never fully appreciated the vast labyrinth of systems required to maintain the habitable bubble that allowed human life to exist on the lunar surface. They passed through hydroponics bays where automated systems tended to precisely arrange rows of essential plants, water recycling stations humming with the constant flow of liquid being purified for reuse, and power distribution nodes with their distinctive electrical vibration. Finally, they reached a section that appeared largely abandoned, evidence of the colony's contraction from its original ambitious scope. A fine layer of dust had settled on equipment that clearly hadn't been activated in months, and several overhead lights flickered intermittently or had failed completely. Without replacement, Alyson led them confidently to a heavy metal door marked with warning symbols and the text "Technical Maintenance. Access authorized personnel only. This represents the termination point of your accompanying presence," she stated firmly, positioning herself between Anthony and the door with unmistakable protective intent. Anthony stared at the maintenance access door with growing concern. "You're residing within a technical maintenance area. Is such an environment suitable for habitation?" Alyson met his questioning gaze with unwavering determination. "You provided assurance of compliance with our conditions." He had indeed promised, but the thought of these children returning to what was potentially a hazardous technical environment filled him with profound unease. "Does this location meet minimum safety requirements?" he asked, unable to simply walk away without some confirmation. "It provides greater security than external alternatives," Elisansa replied with cryptic finality before Anthony could formulate a response that might extract more information without breaking his promise. The distant sound of voices and rhythmic footsteps echoed down the corridor, a security patrol moving through an area that supposedly required no regular monitoring. Elisansa's eyes widened in unmistakable alarm, her body tensing for immediate action. Without verbal communication, she yanked the heavy door open with surprising strength and pulled Keela inside. Anthony, acting on instinct rather than considered judgment, followed them through the narrowing gap before the door could seal them out. Environment beyond the threshold defied all his expectations, rather than the anticipated maintenance area filled with technical equipment and potential hazards. He found himself standing at the edge of a large storage chamber that had been meticulously repurposed into a makeshift communal living space. Most shocking of all was the realization that Elisansa and Keela were not alone in their precarious existence. Dozens of blue-skinned cerulean children of varying ages looked up at his sudden entrance, their expressions ranging from curious assessment to undisguised fear. Some huddled together on bedding created from shipping materials and discarded insulation, while others sat in small groups engaged in what appeared to be organized educational activities or simple games that required no specialized equipment. The oldest among them appeared to be in their mid-adolescence by human developmental standards. The youngest barely passed infancy. The chamber itself represented a remarkable testament to resourcefulness and determination in the face of extreme limitation. Standard shipping containers had been ingeniously arranged to create separate, designated areas for different functions. Insulation blankets hung as privacy barriers between sleeping sections, and someone with considerable artistic ability had painted colorful murals on some walls, stylized depictions of what Anthony assumed must be Cyrillian landscapes, all rendered in pigments that appeared to have been created from repurposed maintenance chemicals. Despite these valiant efforts to create livable conditions, the harsh reality remained inescapable. Condensation from temperature differentials between sections caused water to drip steadily from overhead pipes, creating perpetual puddles on the metal flooring. The recycled air carried a distinctive dampness and the unmistakable odor of too many bodies existing in insufficient space. The lighting functioned inconsistently, leaving some areas in near darkness, while others received harsh illumination from exposed elements. What is the nature of this location? Anthony asked in a hushed voice, the question directed toward Elisansa, but audible to all present. The children had fallen into complete silence at his unexpected arrival, but now an older male adolescent stepped forward, positioning himself protectively before the younger children, with a stance that suggested readiness to defend them despite his obvious physical disadvantage against an adult human. Identify yourself and your purpose, he demanded of Anthony, his translator, conveying both authority and warning. Despite his youth, he provides nutritional support. Elisansa explained quickly, her body language displaying clear deference to the older youth. He accompanied us despite recommendations against such action. The adolescent turned his full attention to Anthony, his stance making it unequivocally clear that despite his youth, he considered himself responsible for the other's safety and would act accordingly if necessary. Your presence here violates established security protocols. This location is designated as restricted. Anthony raised his hands in a universal gesture indicating peaceful intent. I assure you I have no hostile purpose, he stated calmly, consciously keeping his posture relaxed and non-threatening. I've been providing food for Elisansa and Kelia for several weeks. My only concern was ensuring they had safe accommodation. The older youth maintained his protective stance, but a younger female child approached him, communicating something in their native language through gestures and whispered words. After a brief exchange that seemed to involve multiple perspectives from other children, he nodded with apparent reluctance. I am designated as Tavari, he introduced himself with formal precision. I function as primary caretaker for the younger individuals. Anthony surveyed the scene again with greater attention to detail, the full implications of what he was witnessing becoming increasingly clear and troubling. Where are your adult guardians? He asked carefully. Your parents or Designated caretakers. Tavari's expression hardened. Perceptibly. Departed, they traveled to Earth for employment opportunities before implementation of diplomatic restrictions. When they attempted return journey, his precisely constructed sentence remained deliberately unfinished, the implication hanging in the recycled air. They were denied permission to return to the colony. Anthony completed the political reality he had heard about in abstract terms suddenly taking on painfully concrete form. Tavari confirmed with a single sharp nod. We remained here with a single adult, designated for supervisory responsibilities covering all juveniles. He experienced terminal biological failure 3 lunar cycles previous. Systemic infection. The clinical terminology couldn't disguise the emotional impact evident in his voice despite the translators. Mechanical rendering. We have maintained operational status while awaiting official response, but communication channels remain unacknowledged. Anthony looked around at the faces, watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to trepidation. Children who had been abandoned through no fault of their own, caught in political machinery that had deemed them insufficiently important to warrant basic humanitarian consideration. Children who had, with remarkable resilience and resourcefulness, created their own functional society in this forgotten corner of the colony because the alternative was unthinkable. How many individuals comprise your group? Anthony asked quietly, struggling to process the scale of the situation confronting him. 37, Tavari answered with precise certainty. The youngest Meralda has completed 2 orbital cycles since emergence. 2 years old, Anthony translated. Mentally, a cold weight settling in his stomach as he caught sight of a toddler being comforted by an older child in the far corner. Alessandra stepped forward, standing beside Tavari with newfound confidence. In Anthony's presence, we located this facility after our assigned guardian disappeared without explanation. Tavari and the established community accepted our integration request. Her expression softened noticeably as she glanced at the older boy. They redistribute available resources to ensure equitable allocation, which represents increasingly inadequate quantities. Tavari acknowledged with frank assessment. We utilize discarded materials and excess resources the colony administration designates as waste. Your provided nutrition. He glanced meaningfully at the small container Kaylee still clutched, containing the extra meal Anthony had prepared. It has substantially improved survival metrics for the youngest demographic. Anthony's mind raced through potential responses, attempting to reconcile everything he was learning with his understanding of colony operations and his own moral imperatives. These children had been surviving independently, hidden within a forgotten section of infrastructure for months, while administrative officials argued about trade agreements and diplomatic protocols. Children literally starved in the shadows, invisible and disregarded. I need to provide assistance, he stated firmly, the decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. For everyone here, not just Alisansa and Kelia. Tavari's expression shifted to one of calculated suspicion. Specify the nature of this proposed assistance. Nutrition primarily, Anthony outlined. I can prepare sufficient quantities to adequately feed everyone. not just the minimal supplements I've been sending with Alasansa and Kelia. And subsequently, Tavari challenged his advanced language skills and natural leadership evident despite his youth. You will report our presence to colony administration. They will forcibly separate our community, sending individuals to disparate locations or potentially mandate return to ancestral territories that represent unknown environments to many who were born within colony parameters. I won't report you to authorities, Anthony promised, though part of his mind questioned whether this represented the most responsible decision. These children clearly required comprehensive care, proper medical attention, educational resources, appropriate living conditions, elements he couldn't provide independently. Yet he also recognized the legitimacy of Tavari's fear. In times of political tension, vulnerable populations often became convenient bargaining chips there. Individual needs subordinated to larger political calculations. My only objective is providing help. He reiterated, let me bring adequate food tomorrow, enough for everyone, not just minimal supplementation. We can address longer-term considerations after addressing immediate nutritional deficiencies. Tavari studied him with remarkable intensity for several extended moments, then turned to confer with several older children. Their discussion proceeded with surprising organizational structure, suggesting established decision-making protocols. Occasional glances toward Anthony suggested he remained the primary topic of their deliberation. Finally, Tavari turned back, his decision apparently reached with community consultation. You may provide nutritional resources, he conceded with measured caution. However, you must arrive only at designated times, following established security protocols and without additional accompanying individuals. Should you betray our location to colony administration, the unfinished statement carried clear warning. Despite lacking specific threats, Anthony nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the trust being extended. I will not betray your confidence or safety. As Alasansa guided him back toward more populated sections of the colony, his mind already calculated resource requirements, transportation logistics, and methods to acquire necessary supplies without triggering administrative scrutiny. The image of little Marala, only 2 years old and living in that cold, damp environment without proper care, remained foremost in his thoughts. He had given his word, and he intended to honor it completely, regardless of colony regulations or potential personal consequences. These were children existing in desperate circumstances. Nothing else carried comparable moral weight. That night, Anthony returned to his kitchen and worked without interruption until the artificial dawn cycle began. He prepared enormous quantities of nutrient-dense soup, utilizing every vegetable remaining in his weekly allocation. He baked bread with his entire remaining flour supply, adding supplemental proteins and vitamins to increase nutritional value. He prepared portable meal packages that could be easily distributed and would maintain safety standards for several days of consumption. He systematically depleted nearly all his available supplies, knowing he would need to provide creative explanations to the colony quartermaster, but finding himself entirely unconcerned about potential Administrative consequences. When he finally permitted himself minimal rest, his dreams were haunted by blue-skinned children with hollow cheeks and eyes that had witnessed hardships no child should experience, regardless of species origin. The following day, after concluding normal operational hours during which not a single customer had appeared, Anthony carefully loaded his prepared provisions onto a maintenance service cart he had appropriated from a storage area. He covered everything with insulated blankets to prevent temperature degradation and to avoid triggering curiosity from any colonists he might encounter during transit. His heart rate increased substantially each time he passed another human resident, certainty building that his clandestine activities must somehow be visibly obvious despite his careful preparations. Tavari waited vigilantly at the entrance to the maintenance sector, his thin frame radiating tension as he monitored the corridor in both directions. When he identified Anthony approaching with the cart laden with food, something resembling relief briefly transformed his features, though he quickly suppressed the emotional display behind his customary guardedness. "You have returned as indicated," he observed, the translator unable to fully convey the complex emotional undertones in those simple words. "I provided assurance of my intentions," Anthony replied simply, maneuvering the cart forward. "I've prepared substantial nutrition, soup with enhanced protein content, bread with supplemental vitamins, preserved fruit from the hydroponics bay, and packaged meals for subsequent consumption cycles." Inside the repurposed storage facility, the children gathered with expressions ranging from cautious optimism to outright excitement as Anthony and Tavari began systematic distribution of the food. The younger ones could barely contain their anticipation at the sight of fresh bread, and even the older children's disciplined composure wavered noticeably at the aroma of hot soup after what had clearly been an extended period of minimal sustenance. Elisansa organized the smallest children into an orderly distribution line, her natural leadership abilities evident. Despite her youth, Kelia transported serving implements with solemn dignity, clearly proud of her contribution to the community effort. As they consumed their meal, Anthony observed their living conditions with greater attention than his initial shocked assessment had permitted. The space, while impressively organized, remained fundamentally unsuitable for long-term habitation, particularly for developing children. The environmental regulation system functioned at minimal capacity, creating inconsistent temperature zones and inadequate air circulation. The improvised sleeping arrangements, while creative, provided insufficient insulation from the metal flooring's perpetual coldness. In one corner he noticed an area designated for medical care, where an older female child was treating a younger one showing symptoms of respiratory distress using what appeared to be limited medical supplies acquired from unknown sources. "How long has your community existed in this location?" Anthony asked Tavari quietly as they observed the others eating with evident relief and gratitude. "Duration varies by individual," the adolescent explained. "The initial group established residence approximately 12 lunar cycles previous, coinciding with implementation of the first diplomatic restriction protocols. Others arrived during subsequent periods, as additional limitations prevented Adult guardian returns. 12 lunar cycles, Anthony repeated the implications sinking deeper. You've maintained this community for a full year and no one within colony administration noticed, or no one deemed it sufficiently important to address. Tavares' expression hardened with justified bitterness. Individuals perceive selectively, based on preference and priority, Cyrillian. Juveniles represent minimal administrative concern within current political framework. The assessment, while harsh, aligned with Anthony's growing understanding of how easily vulnerable populations could become invisible within systems designed to prioritize political and economic considerations over basic humanitarian imperatives. The diplomatic tensions between Earth and Cyrilia had developed gradually over years, beginning with trade disputes over mining rights in the asteroid belt and culminating in increasingly restrictive travel protocols that had effectively separated these children from their parents or guardians. Nova Orlia, positioned on the far side of the moon, existed in a peculiar jurisdictional space, technically under Earth's administrative authority but sufficiently removed to become a convenient location for forgetting inconvenient responsibilities when politically expedient. What about your government representatives? Anthony inquired, keeping his voice low to avoid distressing the other children. Surely the Cyrillian diplomatic corps would intervene if they became aware of your situation. The diplomatic outpost terminated operations approximately 4 standard months previous, Tavares informed him. With resignation, the final official representative departed on the transport vessel that denied boarding access to our parental guardians. His laugh carried no trace of genuine humor. We exist as citizens of no recognized territory, neither Earth nor Cyrilia, claiming responsibility for our welfare. Anthony watched as Kelia helped distribute additional bread to the youngest children, her movements displaying remarkable care and maturity despite her own young age. These children had created a remarkably functional community through necessity, with older members assuming responsibility for younger ones, sharing their limited resources with impressive equity. The situation was simultaneously inspiring in its demonstration of resilience and utterly heartbreaking in its necessity. I will return tomorrow, Anthony declared with firm resolution. And subsequent days, I'll provide maximum possible nutritional support given available resources. Tavares studied him with penetrating assessment, his large eyes seeming to evaluate factors beyond Anthony's verbal commitment. What motivates this assistance when your own species has demonstrated consistent disinterest in our survival? The question deserved serious consideration, prompting Anthony to examine his own motivations beyond surface level humanitarian impulse. Why indeed was he willing to risk his livelihood, possibly even his residency status within the colony, for children belonging to a species increasingly positioned as diplomatic adversaries to his own? The answer materialized as he observed Elisansa gently wiping soup from a toddler's face, her movements exhibiting remarkable tenderness despite the calluses visible on her small hands, evidence of labor no child should have had to perform, because providing help when it's within your capacity represents the correct moral choice, he explained with straightforward conviction, and because someone should have been offering this assistance from the beginning. Over the subsequent 2 weeks, Anthony established a consistent operational pattern. He maintained normal business hours at his dining establishment, though customer appearances remained virtually non-existent. After official closing, he devoted several hours to preparing substantial meals and nutritional packages. Each night he navigated the increasingly familiar route through the colony's maintenance corridors to deliver food to the children. Sometimes he remained for extended periods, helping distribute meals or simply interacting with the younger ones who had begun anticipating his visits, not just for the sustenance he provided, but for the stories about Earth that he shared, descriptions of oceans, forests, and animals that many of them had never experienced directly. Through these regular interactions, he gained deeper understanding of their lives both before and after their effective abandonment on Nova Orlia. Many had been born within the colony, their parents serving in diplomatic or commercial capacities within the once thriving Cyrillian community. Others had originated on Cyrilia itself, or other colonial outposts throughout the solar system. Despite their diverse origins, they had formed impressively strong communal bonds through their shared adversity. Tavari, he discovered, through gradual conversations, had been engaged in advanced preparation for entrance into the prestigious Cyrillian Scientific Academy before the diplomatic crisis disrupted his education. At 16, by Earth chronological standards, he already demonstrated remarkable mastery of complex mathematical principles and could discuss astronomical phenomena with surprising sophistication. And GT clears throat. And GT. Now he applied that knowledge primarily to maintaining the hideout's basic environmental systems and providing educational continuity for the younger children. Ellie Sansa eventually revealed that she and Kelia were the daughters of a mid-level diplomatic attaché responsible for cultural exchange initiatives. Their mother had traveled to Earth for emergency diplomatic consultations when the restrictive protocols were suddenly implemented, leaving them in the care of administrative assistant who had eventually abandoned them when resource scarcity became acute. Each individual story added emotional weight to Anthony's commitment while simultaneously increasing his concern about sustainable solutions. His personal resources were demonstrably limited and diminishing rapidly. The colony quartermaster had already questioned his increased requisitions, forcing him to utilize his dwindling personal financial reserves for supplementary supplies. More alarmingly, he had noticed Megan and other security personnel conducting more frequent patrol patterns near his establishment, their attention focusing on him with increasing duration and intensity. After one such delivery, as Anthony was returning to his assigned residential unit, his growing apprehension materialized into concrete reality. Megan emerged unexpectedly from an intersecting corridor, her deliberate positioning making it unmistakably clear. This encounter was not coincidental. Your activity patterns have increased significantly, she observed, falling into step beside him with practiced casualness belied by the tension in her posture. Anthony maintained neutral expression despite his accelerated heart rate. The Operational demands of maintaining even a minimally functional business. Establishment required consistent effort. I was referring specifically to your nocturnal movements through lower maintenance sectors, Megan clarified, her voice lowered despite the currently deserted corridor. You've been making regular excursions to restricted areas while transporting substantial resource quantities. Anthony's internal alarm intensified, though he maintained outward composure. I wasn't aware that routine movement within the colony required security, authorization, or monitoring. Standard movements don't, Megan confirmed, until individuals begin displaying behavioral patterns consistent with potential security concerns. She stopped walking abruptly, forcing Anthony to halt as well. I implemented tracking measures on your transport card 3 standard days ago. After multiple reports of unusual activity, cold apprehension settled in Anthony's stomach, though he maintained neutral expression. Am I currently under official surveillance? He asked carefully, avoiding accusatory tone despite his internal reaction. Not at present, Megan replied, something in her vocal modulation, possibly regret, giving Anthony momentary pause. But formal monitoring protocols will be implemented if your current behavioral patterns continue. Whatever unauthorized activity you're engaged in, Anthony, it represents potentially significant risk to your colonial status. Perhaps some considerations transcend personal security or administrative compliance, he countered, meeting her evaluative gaze directly. Megan sighed, her official demeanor partially yielding to what appeared to be genuine personal concern. Listen, I've known you since your initial arrival approximately 3 standard years ago. You've consistently demonstrated regulation compliance and maintained appropriate behavioral boundaries. This sudden deviation from established patterns, she hesitated, searching for appropriate phrasing. It represents concerning departure from your historical operational norms. Perhaps my previous patterns reflected insufficient moral engagement, Anthony suggested quietly. Perhaps complying with regulations without questioning their underlying ethical validity represents its own form of failure. That philosophical perspective exceeds our designated function, Megan reminded him with renewed professional distance. We exist as colonial residents. Our responsibility centers on adherence to established protocols, even when those protocols result in demonstrable harm to vulnerable populations lacking alternative protection. Megan's expression hardened perceptibly. Is this situation connected to the Cerulean juveniles you were previously feeding? Because that represents a significantly more complex security consideration than you apparently appreciate. Then help me understand the supposedly justifiable reasons why children should experience hunger and inadequate shelter while administrative authorities engage in abstract political calculations. Anthony challenged, surprising both himself and Megan with his uncharacteristic confrontational approach. The situation involves multiple jurisdictional and diplomatic factors. The situation involves children experiencing unnecessary suffering. Anthony interrupted with unprecedented vehemence. Their species classification, political affiliation, or documentation status doesn't alter that fundamental reality. Megan studied him for an extended moment, her expression unreadable behind professional neutrality. Finally, she stepped back, creating additional physical distance between them. Consider this your only unofficial warning, Anthony, delivered as a personal acquaintance rather than a security official. Whatever unauthorized activities you're conducting have been noticed by administrative systems. The subsequent response won't involve an informal conversation in an empty corridor. She departed without further communication, leaving Anthony with the disturbing realization that his limited time frame for finding sustainable solutions was rapidly contracting. The children needed more permanent assistance than he could provide, independently and quickly, before administrative intervention potentially created worse outcomes. Security incursion occurred 3 days later. Without warning, Anthony was distributing the evening meal, watching with satisfaction as the smallest children in proper portions of protein-enhanced soup when alarm indicators shattered the usual subdued atmosphere of the hideout. Emergency lighting activated in the corridor outside, pulsing red illumination penetrating the edges of the sealed entrance. The reinforced door exploded inward with a deafening impact that sent the youngest children scrambling for protection behind older ones. Security personnel in full tactical equipment poured into the space with practiced efficiency, their uniforms identifying them as specialized enforcement division rather than standard patrol officers. They secured the perimeter with alarming speed, herding the children toward the center of the room with intimidating precision. Tavares attempted resistance, positioning his body between the officers and the youngest children, but was roughly restrained and moved aside. Despite his protests, Anthony found himself directly confronting Megan, whose expression combined professional detachment with unmistakable personal disappointment. I provided clear warning about continued violations, she stated quietly, regret evident despite her formal tone. These are children experiencing displacement and resource deprivation, Anthony protested, raising his voice to be heard above the chaos surrounding them. They represent no conceivable security threat, they simply require basic necessities. Remove him from the premises, Megan directed, and 2 enforcement officers immediately moved to secure Anthony's arms with restraint devices. He struggled against their grip, watching helplessly as the children were systematically separated into groups based on apparent age classifications. The youngest ones were crying, reaching desperately for the older children who had become their surrogate family. Kailala clung to Alyssa with terrified determination, her small body trembling uncontrollably, while Alyssa maintained remarkable composure despite the evident in her eyes. Terminate this action immediately, Anthony shouted, straining against the restraints. They've committed no violations beyond basic survival. Where are you taking them? Unauthorized presence in restricted area, utilization of colony resources without allocation authorization, violation of residential registration protocols, Megan recited with mechanical precision. The list continues with multiple additional infractions. They are children abandoned through diplomatic failures, Anthony insisted, his voice breaking with emotional strain. What possible justification exists for treating them as criminals rather than victims requiring assistance. Before Megan could respond, the atmosphere within the room underwent a subtle but profound transformation. The security personnel positioned near the entrance moved aside with unexpected coordination, creating access for a new arrival whose presence immediately commanded attention from all present. The female figure entered the space with fluid grace, her appearance unlike any individual Anthony had previously encountered. She wore an environmental suit of silvery material that seemed to generate its own subtle illumination. Rather than merely reflecting available light, her skin displayed the characteristic blue luminescence of cerulean physiology, but with significantly greater intensity and refinement than the children's, suggesting either advanced age or elevated social status. She moved with natural authority that required no verbal assertion, and even the armed security officers appeared to instinctively adjust their posture in her presence. "Release them immediately," she commanded, her translator conveying precise diction and unquestionable authority, all of them without exception. Megan stepped forward, her hand moving reflexively toward the weapon secured at her hip. This represents an authorized colony security operation under jurisdiction Code 47A. You possess no intervening authority within this regulatory framework. The woman regarded Megan with such intense focus that the security officer actually retreated one step, an unprecedented reaction from someone known for unwavering professional composure. "I am Viziria, High Counselor of the Cerulean Concordat, and these children exist under my direct protection." Complete silence descended upon the chaotic scene. Even the youngest children ceased their distressed vocalizations, their attention captured by this commanding presence who radiated both authority and unmistakable connection to their species. "Your protection," Megan repeated, evident confusion disrupting her profession demeanor. "All cerulean juveniles exist under my protection by both legal statute and moral obligation," Viziria clarified, though her visual assessment of the room suggested more personal investment than her formal statement acknowledged. "Your human administrative systems have apparently forgotten fundamental ethical obligations regarding vulnerable population care during political disagreements." She moved further into the room with measured steps, and the children created space for her passage with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. When she reached the location where Alisansa and Kelia stood together, she lowered herself to their eye level, gesture that simultaneously acknowledged their personhood while making her own imposing presence less intimidating. She addressed them directly in their native language, soft musical syllables that the translation devices didn't process, and touched each of their faces with gentle movements that contrasted sharply with her otherwise commanding presence. Anthony observed this interaction from his restrained position, understanding gradually crystallizing through his confusion. The manner in which Viziria interacted with the two girls and their response to her presence suggested connection beyond diplomatic responsibility or general species affiliation. This represented personal recognition and emotional bonds that transcended official capacity. Viziria rose to her full height and turned to confront Megan and the other Security personnel, you will release this human. Immediately, she directed, gesturing toward Anthony with elegant precision. And you will arrange appropriate accommodation for these children until proper arrangements can be implemented for their reunion with family units. With appropriate respect, counselor. Megan began, reasserting her professional demeanor despite evident uncertainty regarding proper protocol in this unprecedented situation. Colony regulations governing unauthorized presence in restricted areas clearly specify. Do not speak to me of administrative regulations. Viseria interrupted with controlled intensity. Not when those same regulations have been implemented to separate family units and leave children experiencing resource deprivation in dangerous environmental conditions. Not when your colony administration has systematically ignored their suffering for nearly 12 complete lunar cycles, while claiming adherence to ethical governance standards. Megan glanced toward her superior officer, a stern-featured individual who had maintained position near the entrance throughout the confrontation. After brief silent communication, he provided subtle confirmation, and Megan signaled clear's throat the officers to release Anthony from restraint. The Administrative Council will require consultation regarding these developments, the senior officer stated. With obvious discomfort, established protocols exist for handling non-human residents without proper documentation. Then initiate your consultation process. Viseria interrupted with unmistakable dismissal. But these children will receive appropriate care during your bureaucratic deliberations. And this individual, she indicated Anthony, who was rubbing his wrist where the restraints had created pressure. Marks will face no punitive consequences for demonstrating basic compassion that the remainder of your population conspicuously failed to provide. The security contingent withdrew from the area, Megan departing last after directing one final unreadable glance toward Anthony as the entrance sealed behind them, leaving only Viseria, Anthony, and the children within the space. A collective exhalation seemed to release the accumulated tension. Taveri approached Viseria with careful respect. You arrived, he stated simply, his voice maintaining remarkable steadiness despite the evident emotional impact of her presence. I initiated travel immediately upon receiving confirmation of your situation, she replied, placing her hand briefly on his shoulder in a gesture that conveyed both recognition and respect. I express profound regret for the extended delay before intervention could be implemented. Anthony observed this exchange with growing confusion regarding the complex dynamics unfolding before him. I find myself unable to fully comprehend the current situation, he admitted with direct honesty. Your identity and authority seem to extend beyond typical diplomatic parameters. Viseria turned her attention toward him, her luminous eyes conducting comprehensive assessment. I have accurately represented my position and authority. I serve as High Counselor to the Cerulean Concord, our primary governmental structure. But these specific children, Anthony gestured toward Lasagna and Kelia, who now stood close to Viseria, with notably reduced anxiety compared to their previous demeanor. Your interactions suggest connection beyond general diplomatic responsibility. They are my direct offspring, Viziria, confirmed with simple directness, and the others represent children of our diplomatic representatives, scientific researchers, and commercial specialists, all separated from their parental units by your government's short-sighted policy implementations. Anthony struggled to process this revelation and its implications. You're stating that the mother of these children holds one of the highest governmental positions within cerulean society, and yet they've been living in these conditions, experiencing resource deprivation and inadequate shelter for extended duration. Information flow was deliberately obstructed, Viseria explained, momentary anger flashing across her features before returning to controlled composure. The diplomatic communication channels were systematically closed. My repeated inquiries received no response. Information regarding their situation reached me only when one of our specialized operatives successfully bypassed your communication security protocols. She surveyed the improvised living space with increasing intensity, taking detailed inventory of the leaking environmental regulation systems, the insufficient insulation, the creative but inadequate medical station, and other evidence of desperate adaptation to unacceptable circumstances. Her expression hardened with each new observation. Your administrative systems have substantial accountability requirements to address, she stated with quiet intensity. Anthony couldn't reasonably dispute this assessment. Instead, he asked the question most immediately relevant to current circumstances. What happens in subsequent developmental phases? Viseria's attention returned to him. And GT clears throat. And GT, her expression softening marginally. Now we engage in negotiation processes. For excessive duration, our respective governance systems have engaged in communication failures with those possessing minimal power, experiencing maximum negative impact from their decisions. That pattern terminates effective immediately. She gestured toward the surrounding children who had gathered around Tavari and other older juveniles, observing this exchange with combined wariness and cautious optimism. You provided nutrition for my offspring when your own species representatives refused similar action. Vizier acknowledged with formal precision. For that demonstration of basic ethical understanding, you have my personal gratitude and my protection against potential administrative consequences. Anthony shook his head, still processing the extraordinary developments unfolding around him. I simply provided the assistance any reasonable individual should have offered in similar circumstances, and yet you represented the singular individual who implemented appropriate response, Vizier observed with penetrating insight. Sometimes the simplest ethical actions reveal the most profound truths about individual and collective moral frameworks. The subsequent days proceeded with dizzying rapidity, filled with diplomatic consultations, administrative hearings, and complex negotiations that occurred at governance levels far beyond Anthony's typical operational sphere. He found himself summoned before the colony's ruling council, a 7-member administrative body responsible for all significant operational decisions affecting Nova Orlia. The council chamber projected austere authority through deliberately minimalist design, emphasizing the elevated position of those seated at the crescent-shaped table. Anthony stood alone at the designated testimony position, feeling uncomfortably exposed under the focused illumination and evaluative attention of the counselors. Administrator Lance Harper, notorious throughout the colony for his rigid adherence to regulations, regardless of practical outcomes, initiated the proceedings. Anthony Reeves, you face multiple serious allegations including unauthorized interference in interspecies affairs, providing sanctuary for undocumented non-human entities, and misappropriation of colony resources for unauthorized purposes. How do you respond to these charges? Anthony had mentally prepared various potential defenses during sleepless hours before this hearing. However, standing before this embodiment of administrative authority that had systematically failed vulnerable children, he found himself speaking from unfiltered moral conviction rather than calculated self-preservation. I provided basic nutrition to hungry children, he stated with deliberate simplicity. If that action constitutes violation of your regulatory framework, then your framework requires fundamental ethical reconsideration. Murmured reactions circulated through the chamber at this unexpectedly direct challenge. Harper's expression tightened with visible disapproval. You are not positioned to determine colony policy standards, Mr. Reeves. I occupy the position of witnessing children experiencing unnecessary suffering and possessing capacity to provide assistance. Anthony countered without combative tone but with unwavering conviction. That represents sufficient moral authority to take action, regardless of administrative technicalities. You deliberately exceeded authorized parameters, Harper began, but his statement terminated abruptly as the chamber entrance activated without scheduled authorization. Viceria entered the proceedings accompanied by two Cyrillian officials in formal attire that marked them as diplomatic representatives. Unlike her previous appearance in utilitarian environmental protection gear, she now wore flowing ceremonial garments that seemed to manipulate light in complex patterns that created subtle visual disorientation while simultaneously projecting unmistakable authority. The council members shifted uncomfortably as Viceria positioned herself beside Anthony without requesting permission or acknowledging the council's presumed authority. High Counselor, Harper acknowledged with visible reluctance, this represents an internal colony administrative proceeding. It transformed into a diplomatic matter the moment your policies endangered cerulean citizens, particularly vulnerable juveniles. Viceria interrupted with calm precision. Mr. Reeves functions under my diplomatic protection during these proceedings. Harper exchanged meaningful glances with fellow council members before continuing with apparent discomfort. Regardless of diplomatic considerations, colony regulations require consistent enforcement. Mr. Reeves knowingly violated multiple established protocols with potential security implications. To preserve innocent lives, Anthony interjected, refusing to allow bureaucratic language to obscure the fundamental moral realities. Viceria placed a calming hand on his arm before addressing the council directly. Your species frequently references moral and ethical frameworks in your governance philosophies, she observed, her translator conveying the statement in neutral tones that nonetheless carried unmistakable challenge. You construct your societies upon proclaimed principles of justice and equitable treatment. Yet where was evidence of these principles when children experienced hunger within your controlled environment? The council chamber descended into uncomfortable silence. Even Harper appeared momentarily unable to formulate an appropriate response to this direct ethical confrontation. Visaria continued, her voice maintaining controlled modulation that paradoxically increased its impact. A civilization's actual moral development is measured not through technological achievements or military capacity, but through its treatment of its most vulnerable population segments. Utilizing that measurement standard, how would objective assessment evaluate your governance system? The silence deepened as her pointed question remained suspended in the recycled air. Anthony noticed several counselors displaying physical indicators of discomfort, while others appeared genuinely troubled by the implications of her assessment. Eventually, one of the other administrators, Dr. Elaine, leaned forward with engaged expression. What specific actions would you recommend as appropriate response? Counselor, she inquired, her tone conveying authentic interest rather than defensive deflection. Acknowledge the systemic failures that have occurred, Visaria replied without hesitation. Provide appropriate accommodation and resources for the affected children until they can be reunited with their family units. And revise your policies to prevent administrative efficiency from superseding basic compassionate response to vulnerable populations, regardless of species origin. Dr. Elaine nodded thoughtfully, then directed her attention toward her colleagues. These recommendations appear fundamentally reasonable and aligned with our stated ethical frameworks, despite the procedural irregularities involved. Harper began formulating objection, but discovered himself outvoted as majority. Support became evident through nonverbal cues among the council. After visible internal struggle with this outcome, he conceded with minimal acknowledgement. Very well, we will establish temporary, specialized housing for the cerulean juveniles and initiate comprehensive review of protocols regarding displaced non-human populations. He directed stern attention toward Anthony. Regarding Mr. Reeves, his regulatory violations will be documented, but not pursued with punitive measures. Considering the extenuating circumstances involved, while falling short of complete exoneration, this outcome significantly exceeded Anthony's realistic expectations. As the council adjourned and he accompanied Visaria from the chamber, he experienced noticeable reduction in the anxiety that had become his constant companion throughout this process. Thank you for your intervention, he acknowledged quietly as they traversed the administrative sector of the colony. Your influence clearly affected the outcome considerably. Visaria studied him with penetrating attention. Gratitude should flow in opposite direction. Anthony Reeves, you implemented actions that an entire colonial administration failed to consider: identifying children experiencing deprivation and providing assistance without consideration of potential negative personal consequences. Anyone confronting similar circumstances would have responded identically. He insisted, uncomfortable with characterization as exceptional. Would they, Visaria questioned with gentle skepticism, historical evidence suggests otherwise. During periods of political tension, vulnerable populations typically experience disproportionate negative impacts, and intervention typically comes from minority individuals rather than majority populations or institutional structures. They reached a navigational junction where Visaria's clears throat. Accompanying officials waited to escort her to subsequent diplomatic engagements. Before departing, she turned toward Anthony with final observations. My daughters communicated extensive positive assessment regarding your character and actions, she informed him. Elisansa specifically noted that you never requested compensation or acknowledgement for your assistance, and Kylia, a genuine smile softened her formal demeanor, transforming her features. Kylia stated that you're prepared. Nutrition evoked sensory memory of our home environment. With that parting comment, she continued toward her scheduled responsibilities, leaving Anthony contemplating the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed him from an isolated food provider in a failing business clears throat to standing before colonial leadership beside one of the most significant diplomatic representatives in the solar system. The subsequent period brought substantial transformation to Nova Relia. Under Visaria's persistent diplomatic pressure, colonial administration allocated an entire residential section for the displaced Serlian children. Appropriate medical intervention addressed their accumulated health concerns. Educational resources were provided to continue their developmental progress, and regular communication channels were established with their families on Earth or Serlia. As component of the comprehensive agreement, Anthony received authorization to establish a new dining establishment at the boundary intersection between human and newly designated Serlian residential zones. Elisansa and Kelia enthusiastically assisted with preparation of the space, hanging decorative fabrics from the ceiling structure and creating wall murals representing both Earth and Serlian landscapes. Kelia suggested the establishment name Nutritional Sanctuary, which Anthony modified slightly to Home of Taste for easier pronunciation while preserving the underlying concept of community and sustenance combined. The official commencement date arrived with minimal ceremonial acknowledgement, but significant anticipation among those familiar with recent events. Anthony prepared diverse menu options, incorporating both Earth and Serlian culinary traditions, applying recipes developed with assistance from the older Serlian juveniles who remembered their traditional food preparation techniques. As the entrance portal activated for first public access, he experienced combined pride and anxiety. Would anyone actually patronize this physical representation of interspecies cooperation during a period of continued diplomatic tension? His concerns proved unnecessary. The Seralian children arrived first, led by Tabari in his newly appointed capacity as their official representative in colonial administrative matters. They were subsequently joined by a small contingent of human colonists, primarily those employed in technical support divisions who maintained minimal investment in political disputes compared to their administrative counterparts. By midday cycle, the dining area contained balanced representation from both species, sharing nutrition and conversation with gradually increasing comfort. Anthony navigated the space with satisfaction, ensuring adequate food distribution while observing the subtle, positive interactions developing around him. Kalia had appointed herself his official assistant, transporting small portions of bread to each table with solemn dedication to her responsibilities while practicing basic English vocabulary with human patrons. Near closing time, a disturbance at the entrance caught his attention. A group of maintenance division personnel entered with clearly hostile behavioral indicators, their expressions reflecting disapproval as they surveyed the mixed species gathering. Anthony immediately recognized their leader, a midla technical supervisor named Rourke, notorious throughout the colony for his openly expressed views regarding proper species segregation and maintaining human cultural purity. What exactly is occurring here? Rourke demanded loudly, his confrontational tone immediately disrupting the previously pleasant atmospheric conditions. Providing nutrition to the alien population now are we, the dining area fell silent as attention focused on the newcomers. Anthony moved toward them with calm deliberation, positioning himself between the potential aggressors and the nearest table of children. We are concluding operational hours for today, he stated with controlled firmness. If you desire nutrition, please return during next scheduled service period. Rourke produced a derisive sound, not particularly likely, wouldn't consume nutrition that's been contaminated through contact with non-human entities. He directed dismissive gesture toward the cerulean children who had become motionless, their large eyes reflecting weariness born from previous negative experiences. Then there exists no logical purpose for your current presence, Anthony responded, maintaining composure despite increasing internal tension. Please depart until you develop genuine interest in the establishment services. Rather than complying, Rourke advanced further into the space, his companions spreading behind him in practice formation suggesting previous coordinated confrontations. This sector was designated exclusively for human occupation, he stated with aggressive certainty. Before we began permitting non-humans with manipulative narratives to appropriate resources rightfully belonging to our species. Tavery had risen from his seat, moving to stand beside Anthony with remarkable composure. We appropriate nothing not officially allocated, the adolescent stated with controlled rationality. We simply wish to maintain peaceful existence until family reunification becomes possible. Your species has no legitimate presence in this colonial establishment whatsoever, Rourke responded with increasing hostility, particularly not consuming nutritional resources designated for human population support. The nutrition is mine to distribute according to my determination, Anthony pointed out with reasonable tone. Despite growing concern about the confrontation's potential escalation, and the resources have been officially allocated through proper administrative channels, Rourke's expression darkened with barely controlled anger. Always suspected your species' loyalty was questionable. Reeves didn't anticipate you'd betray your own kind this blatantly, though. Transforming a proper human establishment into this abomination, He gestured dismissively toward the integrated dining area with undisguised revulsion. Anthony perceived a dangerous escalation. Pattern developing. Noted the growing fear reflected in the youngest children's expressions, and recognized that this situation directly contradicted everything he had hoped to create. A neutral space where species differences became secondary to shared basic needs. This was supposed to represent sanctuary from exactly the type of hostility currently threatening to overwhelm it. That's sufficient, he stated with quiet authority. This establishment exists specifically for sharing nutrition and positive interaction. If you cannot respect those fundamental parameters, your presence is not appropriate. For several tense moments, it appeared Rourke might escalate to physical confrontation. His body displayed preparation indicators, and his companions adjusted positions suggesting coordinated aggression before the situation could deteriorate. Further, the entrance activated again, revealing Megan in full security division uniform, her authoritative presence immediately altering the confrontational dynamic. Is everything proceeding according to authorized parameters? She inquired, her gaze shifting meaningfully between Anthony and Rourke. The maintenance supervisor hesitated, visibly calculating potential consequences of continued confrontation with official security present. Finally, he stepped back with reluctant disengagement. Just departing, he muttered, directing final hostile glare toward Anthony before exiting with his companions following. As the tension gradually dissipated and normal activity resumed, Anthony approached Megan with genuine appreciation. Your timing proved remarkably fortuitous, he acknowledged. Thank you for the intervention. Megan shrugged with studied neutrality, simply performing standard security functions, maintaining peaceful operational environment. Nevertheless, the intervention prevented potential escalation. She surveyed the dining establishment, observing the mixed groupings of human and cerulean juveniles, the colorful decorations, the shared nutrition and interaction occurring despite recent tensions. This represents significant departure from your previous operational model, she observed with professional detachment. For substantially improved outcomes, Anthony responded confidently. Megan didn't immediately respond, her attention lingering on a table where Kaelia was demonstrating a cerulean coordination game to human child of approximately equivalent developmental stage. Perhaps, she finally conceded, with minimal acknowledgement, but not everyone shares your perspective regarding appropriate colony development. Direction change inherently creates resistance, Anthony acknowledged. Realistically, particularly when implementation occurs without consensus building processes. Megan pointed out the Council's decisions regarding integration policies encountered significant opposition from multiple colonial sectors. They represented the ethically appropriate decisions regardless of popularity metrics, Anthony insisted, maintaining conviction despite understanding the practical complications. She referenced. Megan studied him with unreadable expression. You genuinely believe individual action can meaningfully impact established systemic patterns, don't you? That personal choices matter against institutional momentum. I believe abdication of individual Moral responsibility guarantees continuation of systemic failures. Anthony replied with simple conviction. Otherwise, what purpose exists in our continued social participation? Megan appeared prepared to continue this philosophical exchange when her communication device activated with operational alert. She verified the message briefly, then straightened posture with professional refocus. Duty requirements necessitate departure. Just maintain awareness of potential concerns. Anthony, not everyone has embraced recent changes with equal enthusiasm. After her departure, Anthony returned to his operational responsibilities, clearing serving implements and preparing for subsequent days' activities. As final patrons departed, he found himself alone with Elisansa and Kealia, who had remained to assist with organizational tasks. That human male displayed aggressive behavioral indicators, Kealia observed, while carefully stacking consumption. Vessel, his physiological responses suggested potential for physical confrontation. Not because of anything you did wrong, Anthony assured her gently. Some individuals experience difficulty accepting differences or adapting to changing circumstances. Elisansa, demonstrating perceptiveness exceeding her chronological development, looked up from cleaning surfaces. He represents merely initial resistance. Manifestation, she stated with pragmatic assessment. Others sharing his perspective will present subsequent challenges. Anthony couldn't reasonably dispute this prediction. Yes, he acknowledged honestly, there will likely be others who resist integration efforts or express hostility toward your presence, but there will also be individuals who recognize our fundamental similarities despite superficial physiological variations. Kealia suggested with hopeful perspective, individuals who understand shared requirements transcend species differentiation, like nutritional necessities. She added with childlike simplicity, everyone requires sustenance regardless of specific biological composition. Anthony smiled, touched by her straightforward wisdom. Exactly. Nutrition represents perfect example of universal requirement transcending surface differences. As they completed organizational tasks, Anthony reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this precise moment, from isolated food provider in an empty establishment to central participant in an interspecies diplomatic incident that had transformed colonial policy, all beginning with the simple decision to provide food for 2 hungry children. Life contained remarkable unpredictability. He considered, you never could predict which apparently minor compassionate choice might expand outward, affecting not just individual lives but entire communities. Perhaps that represented the fundamental purpose, not attempting comprehensive of system transformation through single dramatic actions, but implementing positive change within your immediate sphere of influence, trusting in the cumulative impact of multiple small compassionate choices. 6 standard months passed, bringing both ongoing challenges and incremental progress. The diplomatic relationship between Earth and Shurlia remained complicated, but communication channels had reopened substantially, largely due to Viziria's direct intervention through newly established diplomatic frameworks. Some Shurlian children had achieved reunification with their parental units, either returning to their ancestral homeworld or relocating to Earthside colonies where restrictive protocols had been strategically modified. Those remaining on Nova Orlia had gradually achieved integration into the broader colonial community, though with varying degrees of acceptance. The dining establishment continued functioning as neutral territory where species boundaries temporarily dissolved in favor of shared nutrition and communication. Not everyone embraced these developments predictably. Periodic incidents occurred, defacement of the establishment's exterior with hostile messaging, occasional confrontations when certain colonial factions encounter cerulean juveniles, shared spaces, and one particularly concerning incident involving deliberate ignition of the storage area containing preserved food supplies. Each time Anthony simply addressed the damage and continued operations, refusing to permit hostility or fear to dictate his behavioral responses. He was preparing for the midday service period when urgency, her usual composed demeanor, disrupted by evident concern. "What's happened?" he inquired, immediately setting aside his food preparation implements. Eli's answer hesitated momentarily before responding. "A gathering of humans has assembled near our residential sector. They display aggressive communication indicators and are carrying physical messaging devices with hostile content. Their behavior suggests organized protest activity rather than spontaneous assembly." Anthony activated his communication device to alert security services while simultaneously accessing monitoring systems to assess the situation. "How many individuals are participating in this gathering?" Preliminary assessment indicates approximately 50 participants. Eli's answer reported with the precision she had developed through her ongoing education. Primary coordination appears centralized through the maintenance division supervisor designated as Rourke. Anthony experienced immediate concern. Escalation. This wasn't a spontaneous gathering but an orchestrated demonstration with potential for serious negative outcomes. "Where are colony security services?" Responding, he asked, already moving toward the entrance. Taveri entered unexpectedly, his normally controlled demeanor showing similar urgency. "The demonstration participants are proceeding in this direction," he reported concisely. "Security presence appears limited to officer operating independently. Additional security personnel." He paused meaningfully. Their response timing suggests potential deliberate delay. Anthony processed this information with growing apprehension. Either security services were overwhelmed with higher priority situations elsewhere in the colony, or, more concerning, some security personnel were deliberately slow walking their response due to personal alignment with the protesters' perspectives. "All right," Anthony decided, moving toward the entrance with determined purpose. "Taveri, please escort Alicent back to the residential sector immediately. Ensure all younger children remain inside with secured access points until security establishes appropriate perimeter control." "What actions will you implement?" Alicent asked, her large eyes reflecting genuine concern for his safety. "I need to protect this establishment," Anthony explained with calm certainty. "This represents more than just nutrition distribution center. It symbolizes the possibility of cooperation rather than conflict. I cannot abandon that principle, particularly when challenged. Taveri appeared prepared to contest this decision, but nodded with reluctant acceptance, recognizing the logic, despite the potential personal risk involved. He guided Alyssum toward the rear exit, both moving with the efficient purpose that characterized their shared leadership responsibilities. As they departed, Anthony moved to the front entrance of the dining establishment. Through the transparent panels, he could see the approaching crowd: maintenance workers, technical staff, even some administrative personnel carrying hastily created display boards with messages like "Humans first" and "Return aliens to their own kind." Leading the procession was Rourke, his face flushed with the distinctive combination of self-righteousness and barely contained aggression that characterized those who believed their privileged position was under threat from those previously marginalized. Beside him walked several other maintenance division supervisors, Anthony recognized as consistent participants in previous smaller confrontations, their expressions reflecting similar hostility. Anthony considered available response options. Sealing the entrance might temporarily delay confrontation, but would ultimately only postpone inevitable interaction if the crowd remained determined. Attempting rational dialogue represented uncertain probability of success given the emotional intensity displayed by the approaching group. Waiting for security intervention increasingly appeared unreliable given the concerning delay in their response. Before he could implement any specific strategy, the crowd reached the establishment's entrance. Rourke pushed through the doorway first, his followers close behind, quickly filling the dining area with their tense presence and hostile energy. "Well, observe who maintains presence," Rourke announced with sarcastic emphasis, his gaze sweeping the currently empty establishment before focusing on Anthony with undisguised contempt. "Where are your non-human associates, Reeves? Have they recognized the wisdom of remaining concealed?" Anthony maintained his position, deliberately projecting calm despite accelerated heart rate. "The establishment doesn't commence regular service for another standard hour," he explained with reasonable tone. "No one is hiding, and you are currently violating operational protocols by entering during preparation period." Rourke produced harsh laughter devoid of genuine humor. "Operational protocols in a human facility you've transformed into alien territory. I reject your presumption of authority." The crowd had distributed themselves throughout the dining area, creating an intimidating presence with their numbers and barely contained aggressive energy. Some positioned themselves near the entrance, seemingly uncertain about their role in whatever was about to unfold. Others moved forward eagerly, surrounding Anthony in a loose containment formation. "What specifically do you want, Rourke?" Anthony asked directly, hoping to channel the confrontation into verbal rather than physical expression. "We want our colony restored to proper function," Rourke declared with theatrical volume, clearly intended for his audience rather than Anthony alone. "We demand clears throat termination of these integration policies that undermine human authority by granting non-humans equivalent status and resource access. We require the aliens return to their appropriate territories far from human. Settlement. Murmurs of agreement circulated through the gathered crowd. Anthony observed expressions distorted, with anger, with fear, with the particular form of hatred that develops from feeling threatened by unfamiliar presence or perceived loss of established position. Those aliens are children who experienced abandonment through no personal fault, Anthony reminded them, feeling his own anger rising despite efforts to maintain reasoned approach. Children who were homeless and hungry until intervention finally occurred. Children who deserve compassion rather than hostility, regardless of their species classification. Not our responsibility, one of Rourke's associates called out from the group. They aren't our offspring. Our concern properly focuses on our own kind. Anthony stared at the man with genuine incomprehension. And that represents your ethical framework, allowing children to suffer because they weren't born with identical physiological characteristics to yours. What moral standard does that reflect? The standard that prioritizes our own survival, Rourke insisted, stepping closer with aggressive intent. The standard that recognizes proper species loyalty. The standard that doesn't surrender what belongs to humans. Nothing is being taken from anyone, Anthony argued with growing frustration. The colony possesses abundant resources. When properly allocated, this situation doesn't reflect scarcity, it reflects fear of perceived difference. Rourke's expression darkened dangerously. You presume to identify me as experiencing fear, Reeves. I suggest we all experience fear regarding unfamiliar circumstances. Anthony replied, attempting de-escalation despite recognizing its decreasing probability of success. But responsible adults don't permit fear to justify harming vulnerable populations. For a brief moment, it appeared his appeal to reason might have reached at least some of the assembled group. Several exchanged uncertain glances, perhaps reconsidering their participation in whatever Rourke had actually planned beyond intimidation display. But Rourke himself remained unmoved by reason or appeal to compassion. Impressive verbal manipulation, he sneered dismissively, but meaningless. Rhetoric doesn't alter necessary action. This ends immediately, he signaled. Several of his most committed followers, who moved toward the preparation area with obvious destructive intent, Anthony moved to block their path, placing himself physically between them and the equipment. Don't implement this course of action, he warned, abandoning attempts at conciliation. Security services are already responding. Let them arrive, Rourke replied with disturbing confidence. Half of them share our perspective regardless. As the confrontation balanced precariously on the edge of physical violence, the entrance portal activated. Once more, Anthony expected to see Megan or other security personnel, but instead a solitary figure entered. Visaria, without accompanying guards or assistants, her silver diplomatic attire creating subtle illumination patterns in the artificial lighting. The crowd fell silent, many instinctively retreating from this unexpected presence. Even Rourke appeared momentarily disoriented, his aggressive posture faltering when confronted with opposition he hadn't anticipated. Visaria calmly assessed the situation, her luminous eyes registering the hostile signage, the threatening postures, the clear destructive intent. When she spoke, her translator conveyed her words with perfect clarity despite their soft delivery. Is this how humanity resolves disagreement? Through intimidation, displays, and destruction of cooperative efforts. No one answered immediately. Several protesters avoided direct eye contact, suggesting discomfort with having their behavior directly confronted. Visaria continued, moving further into the space with graceful confidence that somehow commanded attention without aggressive display. I have studied your species' developmental history with considerable interest. You have overcome remarkable obstacles: internal warfare, prejudicial social structures, environmental limitations of your original planetary environment. You have extended your presence beyond your birth world and discovered the capacity to interact with diverse species throughout the solar system. Yet here you stand, prepared to destroy a simple nutrition distribution center because it represents cooperation between different species rather than separation. She positioned herself beside Anthony, her presence providing both reassurance and humbling perspective. This individual, she continued, indicating Anthony with elegant gesture, provided sustenance for my offspring when they experienced deprivation. He provided shelter when they lacked secure environment. He recognized their fundamental personhood rather than focusing exclusively on their external characteristics. And for these basic ethical actions, you would implement punishment. Rourke, recovering from his initial shock, stepped forward with forced confidence. This isn't about feeding juvenile aliens, he insisted, though with noticeably reduced conviction. This concerns the colony's fundamental identity, about maintaining human cultural integrity and what constitutes genuine humanity. Visaria inquired with gentle challenge. Is it determined by superficial physical characteristics like dermal pigmentation, visual organ structure, or planetary origin? Or is it defined by behavioral choices, capacity for compassion, willingness to assist those experiencing vulnerability? She surveyed the assembled crowd, her gaze connecting briefly but meaningfully with each participant. I speak now not as diplomatic representative but as parental guardian. My offspring experienced hunger, and this man provided nutrition. They experienced fear, and he offered safety. If these actions don't represent the essence of humanity's highest aspirations, perhaps you have forgotten your own ethical foundations. Profound silence followed her statement. Anthony observed confusion, shame, and uncertainty moving across the faces of many protesters. Even some of Rourke's closest associates appeared uncomfortable, shifting posture and exchanging glances that suggested diminished certainty. Their previously righteous cause. Rourke himself seemed deflated, his earlier aggressive confidence replaced by defensive posturing. This doesn't change fundamental circumstances, he muttered, though the conviction had drained from his voice. It changes everything, Visaria countered with quiet certainty. Or potentially nothing. The determining factor lies in your subsequent choices. She turned toward Anthony, her expression softening perceptibly. You have created something profoundly valuable in this modest space. Not merely a nutrition distribution center, but a connection point between different perspectives. Those unable to recognize its significance demonstrate blindness to their own highest potential. Before Anthony could formulate appropriate response. The entrance activated again, this time admitting Megan with a security response team. They quickly established control parameters, dispersing the crowd with professional efficiency. All unauthorized gatherings must immediately disperse, Megan announced, with official authority. Colony Regulation 27B prohibits assemblies exceeding 20 individuals without prior authorization. The protesters began departing with varying degrees of reluctance, many clearly relieved to have legitimate reason to disengage from a confrontation that had developed beyond their initial expectations. Rourke and his core supporters lingered longer, exchanging meaningful glances that suggested this represented temporary retreat rather than permanent resolution. But eventually they too departed, leaving Anthony, Bazaria, and the security team alone in the dining establishment. Megan approached Anthony, her expression combining professional concern with apparent personal regret. "Are you unharmed?" he confirmed with simple nod, the adrenaline of confrontation beginning to dissipate. No physical damage occurred to either persons or property. This time, Megan noted with pragmatic assessment, will implement increased security patrols in this sector, but realistically, we cannot guarantee similar incidents won't recur with potentially different outcomes. "I understand," Anthony acknowledged, recognizing the practical limitations of security intervention in addressing deeply rooted social tensions. Viseria, who had maintained silent observation during this exchange, spoke again. "Perhaps our approach requires reconsideration," she suggested, thoughtfully. "Attempting to force acceptance often generates increased resistance. What alternative approach would you suggest?" Anthony inquired, surprised by this apparent shift from the diplomatic representative who had been the primary advocate for comprehensive integration policies. "Not abandonment of our objectives," she clarified immediately, "but exploration of alternative implementation methodologies, those focused on developing understanding rather than simply mandating behavioral change." After the security team completed their assessment and departed with assurances of maintaining heightened presence in surrounding areas, Viseria elaborated on her perspective. She proposed developing cultural exchange initiatives, creating opportunities for humans and Shorelians to learn about each other's histories, traditions, and values in non-threatening contexts. The dining establishment, she suggested, could serve as centerpiece for this modified approach, a neutral environment where barriers could be lowered through the universal language of shared nutrition. Consumption of food together represents powerful symbolic and practical connection, she observed, echoing Kalia's earlier insight with remarkable similarity. It creates recognition of shared fundamental requirements regardless of external differences. Anthony considered her proposal thoughtfully. It didn't represent perfect solution to deeply embedded prejudices or resolve the complex political dynamics that had created the current situation, but it offered beginning point, a small step toward the type of community he believed remained possible despite current challenges. "I commit to supporting this approach," he confirmed, "if you believe it has potential for positive outcomes." Bezira regarded him with solemn expression, one individual choosing compassion and response over fear-based. Reaction has already generated substantial positive change. Anthony Reeves, you provided nutrition for two hungry children, never anticipating that one would carry your story to highest governmental levels, never recognizing that their maternal guardian administers not merely a political concordat but substantial portions of this galactic region. Anthony stared at her, processing this extraordinary revelation. Administers the galaxy, he repeated, struggling to comprehend the full implications. Bezira smiled, a gentle expression that transformed her formal features into something more approachable, more personally connected despite physiological differences. Perhaps slight exaggeration, she acknowledged, but my influence extends considerably beyond what your colonial administrators fully comprehend. I could have commanded military intervention to extract my offspring. Instead, I arrived independently because one human demonstrated that forceful response wasn't the only available option. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, in a gesture that transcended species differences. You provided nutrition for hungry children without knowledge of their lineage or status. Through that simple ethical choice, you potentially prevented conflict that would have resulted in substantial casualties. Never underestimate the profound impact of basic compassion. Anthony Reeves, it possesses capacity to transform entire worlds. The new dining establishment, reconstructed after the fire that ultimately occurred several months later, during a period of renewed tension, occupied significantly larger space than the original facility. It stood at the geographic center of the colony, a deliberate placement, acknowledging its symbolic function as connection point between different worlds. The name remained unchanged, though now displayed in both human and Cerealian linguistic systems above the entrance. Home of Taste. Inside the walls featured artwork, created collaboratively by children from both species, depictions of their respective home worlds, their shared experiences, and their hopes for future possibilities. Anthony maintained position at the primary preparation station, creating the day's featured nutrition options. Beside him, Kelia arranged bread portions in serving baskets, her movements demonstrating developed confidence and precision. She had appointed herself his permanent assistant, enthusiastically learning Earth culinary techniques while simultaneously teaching him Cerealian preparation methods. Alisansa moved efficiently between tables, assisting younger children with their food selections. At 14 standard years, she had developed into a natural cultural liaison, facilitating the exchange programs that had gradually begun modifying the underlying social atmosphere within the colony. The integration process hadn't proceeded without complications or setbacks. Some colonists maintained rigid opposition, refusing engagement with the changing social reality. Rourke and several of his closest associates had eventually transferred to Earthside colonies, preferring relocation to adaptation. Others had remained but maintained distance, some eventually finding their way to the dining establishment through curiosity or practical necessity, occasionally developing genuine interest. Beyond initial reluctance, Viseria visited regularly when her diplomatic responsibilities permitted. Today she entered without ceremonial announcement, wearing simpler attire than her official diplomatic garments, only the respectful acknowledgement from Cyrillian patrons and curious observation from newer human colonists indicated her significant status. She approached Anthony's preparation station, accepting the beverage he offered with graceful acknowledgement. The new hydroponics production facility demonstrates encouraging output levels, she observed, noting the fresh vegetation he was preparing. The collaborative cultivation techniques appear highly effective. Credit belongs properly to your scientific specialist, Anthony noted. With appropriate recognition, the partnership between Cyrillian botanical experts and human agricultural specialists had produced significantly improved food production methodologies, benefiting the entire colony. Scientific progress accelerates when diverse perspectives combine resources, Visaria noted, as do communities with similar collaborative approaches. She observed a newly arrived human family entering the establishment. Recent colony transfers based on their somewhat disoriented movements and careful observation of unfamiliar surroundings. They paused momentarily at the entrance, registering the mixed species clientele. With visible uncertainty, Kalia, noticing their arrival, immediately approached with her bread basket and welcoming expression. "Please try this," she offered in carefully practiced standard English. "I participated in its creation." The children looked toward their parental guardians for approval before accepting the offered nutrition. Their initial hesitation transformed into evident enjoyment after tasting, leading to immediate questions about other available options that Kalia answered with growing confidence in cross-species communication. Anthony and Bezaria observed the small interaction, a microcosm of the larger societal process occurring throughout the colony. With increasing frequency, positive change often initiates through such modest interactions, Bezaria observed quietly. Through shared experiences and recognition of commonality, the juveniles typically demonstrate leadership with adult populations, gradually following their example. Anthony nodded in agreement, reflecting on his own transformative journey from isolated food provider to reluctant bridge builder between worlds. The process remains imperfect, he acknowledged realistically. Substantial challenges continue requiring resolution. Perfection represents unattainable standard, Bezaria reminded him with practical wisdom. Progress represents meaningful objective, and progress develops through individual nutrition, servings, conversations, and juvenile smiles rather than sweeping government declarations. She finished her beverage and prepared for departure. Her responsibilities requiring attention elsewhere within the expanding diplomatic framework she had helped establish. Before leaving, she turned toward Anthony one final time. "You once provided nutrition for 2 hungry children, requesting nothing exchange," she stated, echoing her earlier observation. "Today you nourish future possibilities." Remember this perspective when challenges appear overwhelming. Anthony watched as she briefly conversed with Elisansa before continuing to her next obligation. Kelia waved farewell to her mother before returning to her bread distribution responsibilities, proudly explaining the varieties to newly arrived human children with growing communication confidence. The dining establishment hummed with conversation, laughter, and the Fundamental sounds of community, developing through shared experience. It didn't represent complete resolution of prejudice or final answer to complex interspecies political challenges. It offered beginning point, a small space carved from larger environment, where compassion could potentially supersede fear-based reactions. Anthony returned to his food preparation, creating the next nutrition cycle for whoever might require sustenance, human or cerulean, established resident or newcomer. He continued implementing the fundamental approach that had guided him, consistently providing nourishment, creating connection opportunities, one serving at a time, and occasionally he reflected while observing Kaylee, demonstrating proper bread consumption techniques to a human child. That modest approach proved sufficient to initiate meaningful change even within the vastness of galactic politics. If you like this story, click the hype button. This video deserves to be popular. Have a nice day.